He waits in the shadows, counting every breath you take. And he's closer than you think. Subscribe, not for entertainment, but so these stories are never silenced again. The sea was calm when the Aurelian Cross slipped out of harbor in the winter of 1916, too calm, the kind of stillness that made old sailors uneasy, as if the ocean itself were listening. No one spoke of it. On this ship, silence was safer than truth. Captain Elias Moorcroft stood at the helm, unmoving. His reputation sailed ahead of him, strict, unforgiving, cruel when challenged. He believed fear was the only discipline that worked at sea. Under his command, men followed orders without question, slept lightly and learned not to complain. Beneath the main deck, the ship carried a second life. Narrow ventilator shafts twisted through iron and timber like veins through a body. They carried air from the deepest holds to the open sky. When the ship moved, those shafts breathed, slow, uneven sighs that echoed through the walls. Most men learned to ignore it, until the first scream. It cut through the night just after midnight, short, sharp, and sudden. Lanterns flared. Boots thundered down the stairs as the crew rushed toward the lower hold. They found him slumped against a crate, eyes wide as if frozen in the moment of realization. A thin, precise wound marked his side. No blood trail, no weapon, no sign of a struggle. Only the vent above him. Its iron grill was bent inward, scraped and twisted, as though something had pushed through from inside the ship itself. The silence that followed was heavier than the darkness. Captain Moorcroft arrived last. He studied the body without emotion, then turned away. An accident, he said. Carelessness. The deck was scrubbed clean, the body removed, and the watch doubled. Superstition had no place on his vessel, but the ship disagreed. The second death came the following night. Same wound, same loneliness, same damaged vent nearby. Fear crept through the crew like a slow sickness. Men refused to walk alone. Lanterns stayed lit even during daylight. Then the flower appeared. White dust drifted through corridors, clung to boots, gathered near the vents. Some swore they saw movement inside the shafts, something pale, something watching. Whispers spread quietly. A ghost. By the third night, no one slept. The Aurelian Cross groaned as she cut through the water, every creak sounding deliberate. Men lay awake, listening to the ship breathe, counting seconds between sounds, praying not to hear footsteps stop outside their door. Captain Moorcroft still refused to listen. He did not yet understand that the ship was no longer empty, and whatever lived inside it had learned how to move. Morning light did little to calm the crew of the Aurelian Cross. Daytime only revealed what fear had hidden at night. The flower stores were lighter, not empty, not looted, just lighter. The cook noticed first. Then the quartermaster, small amounts gone day after day, enough to dismiss as error until white dust began appearing where it shouldn't, along corridor walls, on ladder rungs, around the mouths of the ventilator shafts, like fingerprints. A sailor named Hart claimed he saw something move behind one of the grills. A face, pale as chalk, eyes dark and wet, staring back at him from inside the wall. When he screamed, the face vanished. Captain Moorcroft struck him for lying. Fear needed an outlet, and Moorcroft made sure it wasn't allowed to grow. He doubled watches, tightened discipline, and reminded the crew that ghosts did not exist. Only weak minds did. That night, one of the watches failed to return. They searched the ship from bow to stern. His lantern was found first, smashed near the cargo hold. Then a dragged crate. Then silence. No body, no blood. Only a ventilator shaft torn wider than before. The ship's carpenter examined it at dawn. He shook his head slowly. No tool did this, he said. Hands did. desperate hands. The idea settled into the crew like poison. Whatever lived inside the ship was not floating through walls. It was crawling, learning, using the vents the way rats use tunnels. And it was hungry. Men stopped eating together. Knives stayed close. Every sound became suspicious. The scrape of iron, the sigh of wood, the steady breathing of the ship itself. Flour dust drifted through the air, catching lantern light and making the darkness look alive. That night, a whisper moved through the vents. Not words, breath. Slow, ragged, human. One sailor swore he heard someone crying inside the walls. Another heard laughter, soft, broken, wrong. No one slept. They sat with their backs against walls, staring at grills, waiting. Just before dawn, the ship screamed. Not a man, the ship. Iron groaned violently. Wood cracked. From every vent, white dust poured out like smoke. In the chaos, something moved through the corridors. Fast, low, precise. Another man fell. By morning, fear had sharpened into cruelty. Trust dissolved. Accusations flew. Moorcroft barked orders louder than ever. But even he avoided standing near the vents now, because he had started to hear it too. The breathing. And for the first time since leaving port, Captain Elias Moorcroft wondered whether the ship was haunted, or whether they had brought something far worse with them. The journal was found by accident. A junior engineer named Collins was sent below deck to inspect a pressure valve near the boilers. The heat down there was suffocating, the air thick with oil and rust. While crawling behind a stack of pipes, his hand struck something soft. Cloth. Wrapped tightly in oilskin and wedged into the shadows was a small bundle. Inside it lay a journal, its pages yellowed, swollen by damp, but still legible. The first entry was dated 6 months earlier. It belonged to Thomas Hale, a deckhand officially listed as dead after a minor fire during repairs. The crew gathered as Collins read aloud. Hale wrote about smoke, confusion, and falling debris, about being knocked unconscious in a service crawl space. When he woke, the ship was quiet, too quiet. Repairs had finished. The ship had sailed. They think I'm dead, one entry read. I can hear them above me. I shout, but the vents swallow my voice. The next pages grew darker. Hale described learning the ship's insides, the vents, shafts, and narrow passages no one ever mapped. He survived by stealing flour from the stores, mixing it with water, licking it from his hands in darkness. Days became weeks. Weeks became something else. I leave marks so they'll know I was here, he wrote. But they don't look. They don't hear. The handwriting changed. Lines bent. Words repeated. I crawl now. It's easier. The light hurts my eyes. I dream of faces that don't see me. When Collins reached the last entry, his voice trembled. If they won't hear me, then they will feel me. Silence followed. Captain Moorcroft tore the journal from his hands. He read quickly, his face hardening. The fire, the missing man, he remembered. Schedules had mattered more than searches. One deckhand lost was acceptable. Delay was not. He folded the journal and ordered it burned. But the truth had already spread. The ghost had a name, and it was human. That night, the ship felt tighter. The vents seemed closer, the darkness more personal. Men whispered apologies to the walls. Others sharpened knives. From inside the ship, something listened. The breathing grew faster, closer, near the end of the night. Laughter echoed through the shafts, high, broken, almost joyful. Then a voice, hoarse and trembling, whispered a single word through the iron. Look. By morning, another man was dead. And Captain Moorcroft finally understood something he had refused to accept since the beginning. Whatever lived inside the Aurelian cross was no longer trying to escape. It was hunting. Captain Elias Moorcroft did not sleep. He stood alone on the bridge as the ship cut through the dark water, the journal's words echoing in his mind like a curse. A man left behind, a mistake buried under schedules and silence. For the first time in years, Moorcroft felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Guilt. By morning, fear had become chaos. Men refused to take lower deck duties. Every vent looked like a watching eye. Every breath of air felt stolen. Moorcroft responded the only way he knew how. With force. He gathered the crew and announced his decision in a voice that allowed no argument. The ventilator shafts would be sealed. If the thing inside the ship used the vents to move, then the ship would deny it that path. Boards were nailed over grills. Iron plates were bolted into place. One by one, the ship's vanes were closed. At first, nothing happened. Then the air changed. Heat settled into the corridors. The lower decks grew thick and heavy. Lantern flames burned weak and yellow. Men began to sweat without working, their breaths shallow and fast. The ship's breathing turned uneven. By afternoon, the first sailor collapsed. By evening, 2 more followed. Panic returned sharper than before. Men clawed at their throats, gasping, eyes wide with the same terror as the dead. The ship groaned loudly now, metal screaming under pressure, wood complaining like something in pain. From inside the walls, the laughter stopped. For a moment, the crew felt relief. Then the killing began again. A man was found dead near the engine room, his wound deeper than before, messier. Blood streaked the floor this time, leading nowhere. The vent beside him had been forced open from within, wood splintered, iron bent. Whatever lived inside the ship was no longer hiding. It was angry. That night, the breathing inside the walls returned, fast, desperate, almost panicked. Something slammed against the sealed shafts again and again, shaking the ship. Men huddled together, listening to the impacts echo through iron and bone. A voice screamed from the walls. Not a ghost, not a monster. A man choking. Moorcroft ordered the vents reopened too late. When boards were torn away, fresh air rushed through the ship like a scream of relief. Men collapsed to their knees, coughing, crying. From one open shaft, a white-smeared hand appeared, then vanished. By dawn, everyone understood the truth. The captain's order had not trapped the killer. It had cornered him. And a cornered man does not think of escape. He thinks of revenge. The sighting happened just before dawn. A thin fog clung to the deck as the Aurelian Cross rolled gently on quiet water. Most of the crew had not slept. They stood in small groups, exhausted, eyes red, listening for sounds they could no longer escape. Then someone screamed, not in fear but in disbelief. Near the bow, one of the ventilator grills had been torn open. The iron bent outward this time, as if the ship itself had exhaled too hard. From the darkness beyond it, something moved. Slowly, a head emerged first, coated completely in white. Flour and sweat had mixed into a thick paste, clinging to skin and hair. In the weak lantern light, the figure looked unreal, pale, faceless, more statue than man. Then the body followed. He climbed out awkwardly, limbs stiff, movements wrong, as if he had forgotten how to stand in open space. His fingers twitched constantly, gripping air that felt unfamiliar. When his bare feet touched the deck, he flinched violently. Light hurt him. He raised his arms, shielding his eyes, and let out a sound halfway between a scream and a sob. The crew froze. No one spoke. No one moved. This was their ghost. Up close, the truth was worse. Beneath the flour, his skin was cracked and raw. His ribs pressed sharply against his chest. His eyes darted wildly, unable to focus, blinking as if the world itself was an attack. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as though words no longer knew how to form. Someone whispered his name. "Thomas!" The figure reacted instantly. At the sound of his name, he shrieked and lunged forward with sudden, terrifying speed. The crew scattered. A knife flashed. A man fell, clutching his side as the white figure vanished, back into the vent with impossible quickness. Silence returned. Blood spread across the deck, bright against the pale dust smeared everywhere. The vent gaped open, empty now, innocent-looking. Captain Moorcroft arrived moments later. For the first time, his face showed fear, not of death, but of recognition. He had seen Thomas Hale before, alive, ordinary, forgotten. Now the ship had turned him into something else. Orders were shouted, nets prepared, lanterns positioned near every opening. They would trap him, end it. But deep inside the ship, Thomas listened, breathing fast, heart pounding against iron walls that had been his world for months. He had been seen, and he would never allow himself to be trapped again. They caught him near the engine room. It took 6 men, nets, and burning lanterns to force him out of the vents. He fought like an animal cornered by light, screaming, biting, clawing at anything that came close. His teeth sank into rope, into flesh, into fear itself. When they finally dragged him into the open, the crew backed away in silence. Without the darkness, Thomas Hale looked smaller, thinner, almost fragile. The flower that once made him a ghost now cracked and flaked from his skin, revealing bruises, burns, and old scars left by metal edges. Ropes were tied around his wrists and ankles. He twisted violently, then went still, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the floor as if the deck were about to vanish beneath him. Captain Moorcroft stood in front of him. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Thomas laughed. It was a broken sound, dry and uneven. He lifted his head slowly, eyes unfocused. You opened the walls," he said, words stumbling over one another. "You finally listened." Moorcroft demanded to know how he survived. Thomas answered in fragments. Flour, water dripping, counting bolts, counting breaths. Dark is safe. Light hurts. I knocked. I screamed. The ship heard me. You didn't. His voice shook when he spoke of the fire, of waking alone, of footsteps above him that never stopped, of learning the vents inch by inch until they felt like home. I waited, he whispered. Then I stopped waiting. A sailor stepped forward, pity softening his fear. That was the mistake. Thomas lunged, teeth snapping. He bit clean through the rope at his wrist, blood spraying as fibers tore. In the chaos, he slammed his head into a lantern, plunging the deck into darkness. He was gone before the light returned. The ropes lay shredded. Blood smeared the iron. A vent nearby hung open, its edges bent inward. The ship swallowed him again. That night, no one spoke of mercy. They knew now that Thomas was not a ghost trapped in the ship. The ship was trapped with him. From deep within the walls, breathing returned, faster than before, purposeful. The vents echoed with movement, not hiding now, but traveling, learning. And as the crew listened, they realized something far worse than fear had settled over the Aurelian cross. Thomas Hale was no longer surviving. He was adapting. The Aurelian cross groaned like a living thing, its hull shifting against the black water, iron joints complaining in long, drawn-out moans. Below deck, the air had grown thin. Lanterns flickered, struggling against the heavy humidity that clung to every surface. Men coughed. Heads pounded. Every inhalation felt borrowed, stolen, like the ship itself was consuming them. Thomas Hale had adapted to this darkness. He moved silently, knowing every turn of every shaft, every shadowed corner. The crew realized too late that the vents were more than passageways. They were hallways of the mind, and Thomas was the master of them. Men began to count their breaths: 1, 2, 3, quickening when panic struck, slowing when fear tried to drown them. Each exhale was a prayer, each inhale a reminder that life was fragile here. In the belly of a ship that had turned predator, the ship slowed. Cargo shifted in the holds with ominous creaks. Lanterns swung on ropes. The wood underfoot felt unsteady, as though it too had learned to watch. In the vents, someone counted too. Breath for breath, step for step, always just a fraction ahead. A sailor tried to scream, but his voice broke into a wheeze. Another fell to his knees, clutching at the floorboards, eyes wide with the understanding that escape was impossible. The air was no longer neutral. It was a weapon. The ship had turned it against them. Moorcroft barked orders, but his voice carried no authority in the suffocating darkness. The men looked at one another, white faces reflecting lantern glow, knowing they were being hunted not by shadows, but by a single relentless human force, thriving in the very passages they had ignored. A scraping sound echoed from a vent overhead, slow, deliberate, like claws on iron. Then a whisper. Not words, only breath, deep, ragged, calculating. The crew counted again. 1, 2, 3. Each inhale shaking, each exhale trembling. The sound of Thomas moving through the ship was now in rhythm with their own desperate lungs. They were running out of air. They were running out of patience. And every breath reminded them of the one truth they could no longer escape. The ship was alive, and it had learned to breathe as he did. By nightfall, men sat huddled near open hatches, counting breaths, praying that the vents were empty, that Thomas had moved on. But deep inside the ship, white dust shifted. Metal scraped, and a low, measured laugh echoed through the shafts. Someone had counted wrong, and in the silence that followed, the ship inhaled again, slow, deep, terrifying. The morning light was weak, slanting through the high portholes like thin knives. Below deck, the air still clung heavy, and the scent of flour and sweat lingered in the corners. The crew sat huddled near the open hatches, knives close, eyes darting to every vent. No one spoke. The tension was too thick for words. Only the creak of wood and the distant slap of water against hull filled the silence. Captain Elias Moorcroft stood before them, rigid as iron, yet with a tremor in his jaw that betrayed him. For weeks he had led them with discipline, with authority, with an unflinching denial of fear. But now the journals, the deaths, the white figure stalking the vents, it had stripped him bare of certainty. He cleared his throat. "The fire," he began, voice low, brittle. "The fire months ago. It wasn't entirely an accident. A deckhand was trapped. We left him behind to save time, to keep schedules. I thought." His eyes swept the crew, seeking any sign of judgment, finding only wide eyes and clenched fists. "I thought it would be better if no one knew. If the ship sailed on. If the mistake stayed buried." Silence followed. The air seemed to press closer. "We were wrong," he said, voice rising slightly. "The ship does not forgive oversight. The sea does not forgive negligence. And neither does he." A ripple of realization passed through the crew. Thomas Hale, the missing deckhand. Not a ghost, not a shadow. A man abandoned, forgotten, transformed by darkness and hunger into something relentless. A sailor whispered, He's been moving through the vents all this time, watching us." Moorcroft nodded. "I know." He swallowed hard. "I tried sealing the vents, thinking it would contain him. I was wrong. That choice only cornered him. He has adapted, and we have awakened him fully." Another pause. Then Moorcroft's shoulders slumped slightly. "We cannot undo what was done, but we can survive it, if we listen." if we respect what we face. The ship is no longer mine to command. It belongs to him now as much as to us. Men exchanged glances, understanding the weight of his words. Every creak, every draft of stale air through the vents, every shadow now held in tension. The ship, once a vessel of orders and schedules, was now a labyrinth of survival. And Thomas Hale was the master of its passages. From deep below, a vent hummed faintly. A scraping sound answered, like fingernails on iron. A soft, ragged laugh floated up, chilling the spine. The captain flinched, but he did not look away. He knew what they faced, and for the first time admitted it openly. The truth hung between them all. The fire was the beginning, and their sins had built the labyrinth. The ship had become alive not with ghosts, but with the vengeance of a forgotten man. And somewhere in the shadows, Thomas listened, smiling beneath the flower, counting breaths, waiting for the next mistake. The plan was simple, or so the crew thought. With Thomas Hale cornered but still unseen, Captain Moorcroft ordered a full inspection of the vents. Hooks, mirrors, ropes, and lanterns were prepared. Every man knew the stakes. One wrong step, and the white figure could strike from above, behind, or below. They entered the narrow shafts in pairs, lanterns clutched tight. The smell of flour and damp wood filled their noses. Every metal screech echoed through the passageways, bouncing from wall to wall, confusing ears and minds alike. At first it seemed orderly. Men tapped with hooks, mirrored reflections catching hidden bends, listening. But the ship had changed. The iron walls groaned under weight and stress. Shafts twisted in subtle ways that made navigation deceptive. Steps that were safe one moment became perilous the next. A shift, a sudden tilt. A metal plate groaning. It was as if the ship itself were mocking them. Corridors narrowed, forcing men to squeeze through impossible gaps. Lantern light flickered against unseen turns. Whispers of flour moved in the shadows, hinting at someone ahead, always just out of reach. From deep within, Thomas watched. Every sound, every breath counted. The ship's creaking became his ally. A vent would collapse slightly under a sailor's weight. Another would tilt to trap a boot. The labyrinth seemed alive. The air was heavy and wet, almost tangible. One man, a sailor named Briggs, struck his lantern against the vent wall to illuminate a tight corner. The reflection revealed flour-smeared fingers gripping the other side. He screamed. A hook swung blindly, clipping a pipe, sending sparks flying. Panic spread faster than the light. Men retreated, only to find the passageways had subtly shifted. Mirrors now reflected unfamiliar corners. Hooks scraped nothing but air. Thomas's laugh, high and fractured, echoed somewhere below. The ship seemed to breathe around them, groaning with their fear, twisting and warping the very shafts they had mapped. Every vent was a trap, every corridor an illusion. They were no longer moving through a ship. They were moving through a mind. Captain Moorcroft shouted orders, but the sound carried differently here. Lost in twisting iron and timber, it became background noise to the hunting rhythm of Thomas. He counted their breaths, learned their patterns, predicted their next movements. By the time the last lantern flickered and died, the crew understood. They were trapped not by walls, not by the ship, but by the predator who had turned the Aurelian Cross into a labyrinth of fear. From somewhere in the vents came a soft whisper, "You shouldn't be here." And in the darkness the ship seemed to answer, folding around them, alive and cruel. The storm hit without warning. Clouds rolled over the horizon, black as spilled ink, and the sea rose with teeth that snapped. At the Aurelian Cross, rain pelted the deck like iron hail, wind shrieking through ropes and rigging. Lanterns swayed violently, some shattering against the deck. The ship groaned under the assault, wood twisting, iron screaming. Below, the vents trembled. The flour dust, stirred by the storm, burst from shafts like snow from hidden chimneys. White clouds filled the air, blinding, choking, clinging to every surface. In that frozen, drifting haze, the crew could see shadows, but could not tell where Thomas Hale moved, or where the vents ended. Then he struck. Fast, silent, precise. A hand flashed from the white mist, grabbing a sailor who had been crawling to a vent. Another near the cargo hold felt the scrape of flour-covered fingers across his back. Screams were muffled by the storm's roar, cries swallowed by the shaking ship. Each strike was calculated, learning, adaptive, inhuman in its speed. The crew scattered, slipping on wet deck boards coated in a thin layer of flour. Men who thought they could hide fell into the storm's chaos. Hooks and ropes swung blindly, lanterns crashed, splintering into sharp fragments. The flour created illusions, white figures, pale hands, faces that seemed to move independently in the mist. Captain Moorcroft tried to command order, his voice swallowed by wind and fear. Men ignored him, instinct driving them to survive rather than obey. Every step became a risk, every glance a potential strike. Thomas moved like a shadow that had learned the ship's anatomy, appearing and vanishing in a heartbeat. A man tripped near the bow. Flour-coated fingers shot out from a vent, gripping him, pulling him into darkness. His scream ended abruptly. Another fell overboard, swept by a wave, lost in the storm's roar. By the time the wind shifted slightly, the white rain had settled. The deck was littered with blood, broken lanterns, and tracks of flour leading to vents where no man should have fit. Thomas had vanished again, leaving only the echoes of his presence. Rapid breathing, the soft shuffle of feet in the walls, and the knowledge that he had survived yet another night. The crew stared across the deck, trembling. They had witnessed him strike, but they had not understood how or why. The storm had been an ally, the flour a mask, and the ship itself a weapon. Captain Moorcroft exhaled slowly. His voice, trembling, finally broke the silence. He is learning, faster than we can follow. From the shadows of the vents, a whisper answered, low and cruel, faster than you can run. The morning after the storm, the deck was quiet, too quiet. Broken lanterns lay scattered, and white flour clung to every surface like a lingering ghost. The survivors moved cautiously, scanning every vent, every shadow, every corner. Captain Moorcroft stood at the helm, rigid, trying to reclaim control, but his orders fell on deaf ears. The men no longer trusted command. Fear had replaced respect. Survival had replaced obedience. "We secure the vents! We trap him!" Moorcroft shouted, voice cracking, but the crew ignored him. Their eyes, red from sleepless nights, met one another and silently communicated what he could no longer enforce. The captain's way was dead. Men ran to open hatches, pushed aside boards, and yanked iron plates from the vents. They risked exposure to Thomas Hale, but air was worth more than fear. The suffocating lower decks had taught them one undeniable truth. The ship could not be tamed by orders. As the vents opened, a heavy, humid breeze filled the corridors. Men gasped, lungs burning, sweat and flour mixing into a gritty paste. For the first time in weeks, they could breathe freely. But freedom came with danger. Thomas could move faster in open air, striking without warning. A shout rang out. One of the men had glimpsed a pale, flour-smeared hand vanish behind a bulkhead. Instantly, chaos erupted. Lanterns swung, ropes were grabbed, hooks thrust. Men yelled, some tripped, some scrambled to barricade themselves. The ship, once obedient under Moorcroft, now heaved and groaned like a living thing resisting control. From somewhere deep within, Thomas watched, counting breaths, learning reactions, smiling beneath the flower that made him look inhuman. Moorcroft barked again, trying to reassert authority. "Form a line! Corner him!" But his voice, though sharp, no longer mattered. The crew's allegiance had shifted. Their lives depended not on discipline, but on instinct, on cooperation, on understanding the labyrinth they navigated together. They acted as one, moving slowly, breathing together, watching the vents, anticipating every possible strike. Moorcroft could only follow behind, powerless, realizing that his time as commander had ended the moment the ship itself sided with its hunted. By nightfall, the men had secured the ship as best they could, opening corridors to the sky, ventilating hold after hold. Thomas was still out there, hidden, counting, learning, but the crew had adapted. Moorcroft finally understood. Authority is meaningless when the ship itself defies you. Survival comes from the collective mind, from listening to the environment, from respecting the predator within the walls. The Aurelian Cross no longer answered to a single man. It answered only to those who could breathe with it, and run with it, and face what lived inside. And Thomas Hale, somewhere in the vents, knew this truth all too well. The first light of dawn broke weakly over the horizon, cutting through storm clouds like pale knives. For the crew of the Aurelian Cross, it was the first morning in weeks they felt the difference in air. Fresh, cool, life-giving. Air that had been stolen from them in the suffocating dark of the lower decks. With the vents finally open, the ship seemed to exhale, relaxing as though it too had been holding its breath. The men took slow, deliberate breaths, savoring the simple act of inhaling without struggle. But they did not let their guard down. Somewhere in the twisting iron and timber, Thomas Hale still moved. He emerged slowly, first a foot, pale and trembling, then a hand coated in white flour and streaked with bruises gripping the vent edge. His movements were hesitant now, awkward. Air burned him, light stung him, and the openness of the deck terrified him more than the shadows ever had. When he fully stepped onto the deck, the crew froze. The human they had feared for so long now appeared fragile, exhausted, diminished. Gone was the ghostly speed, the precision of hunting through shadows. What remained was a man, shrunken, trembling, haunted. He blinked at the sunlight. The salt wind whipped his hair across his pale, raw face. For a moment, he looked around as though seeing the world for the first time. Then he dropped to his knees, coughing, clutching his chest. The men held their positions, wary, unsure whether to strike or help. Captain Moorcroft watched silently, chest tight with guilt and fear, realizing that the terror he had ruled with was finally meeting reality. A sailor whispered, "He's just a man." Thomas looked up, eyes wide, not with menace, but with shock. He had survived months in the labyrinth of the ship, alone, hungry, and transformed by darkness. But the open sky, the fresh air, was breaking him. Every breath was a challenge, every step a revelation. Slowly he rose to his feet. His movements were clumsy, unfamiliar with freedom. The flower that had turned him into a ghost now fell away in fine white clouds, drifting across the deck like snow. For the first time, the crew felt the full weight of their ordeal, the hunting, the suffocating terror, the labyrinth they had entered, and the human they had feared. Thomas Hale was no longer a ghost. He was a man who had survived everything the ship had thrown at him. And as he stood, blinking in the weak sunlight, he seemed almost smaller than the legend had made him. Yet in his eyes lingered the truth of the vents, the storms, the darkness, and the lives he had touched in those silent, twisted corridors. The crew understood. This human was dangerous, not because he was superhuman, but because he had endured the impossible, and the Aurelian cross had survived with him. The Aurelian cross floated in calm waters, a fragile silence settling over the deck. The storm had passed, the vents were open, and Thomas Hale knelt in the pale sunlight, his body trembling, his breath uneven. The crew circled him, weapons lowered but ready, each man carrying the weight of weeks of terror, exhaustion, and fear. The question was simple, yet unbearable. What would they do with the man who had haunted them and survived them? Mercy or punishment? Life or death? Captain Moorcroft stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly. He had commanded them through chaos and fear, yet now he was powerless in the face of human truth. "We cannot let him go," he said quietly. "He has killed. He has hunted. He must answer." A murmur spread among the men, but some shook their heads. "He survived because we failed him first," one sailor said. "He was left behind. We chased schedules while he suffered. If anyone deserves mercy, it is him." The debate raged silently in glances, heavy breaths, and clenched fists. Thomas, kneeling, remained still, watching. He did not speak, did not plead. He seemed to understand that his fate rested not in strength or vengeance, but in the hearts of those who had lived alongside him in darkness. Finally, a vote was taken, wordlessly, eyes meeting eyes. The majority leaned toward mercy. One man, still trembling from fear and rage, voted for judgment. By a single breath, by one man's insistence, mercy was denied. The sea seemed to pause, listening. Thomas stood slowly, hearing the decision. His face was unreadable, pale under the morning sun. There was no struggle, no plea, no scream. He merely nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the verdict. Then, as if the ocean itself had spoken, a wave rocked the ship, slapping the deck. Whitecaps hissed, foam flying. The wind carried a low, mournful sound, almost like a sigh. The Aurelian cross seemed to respond, acknowledging the decision, as if the very waters understood the fragile balance between human law and human survival. Thomas stepped back toward the vents, disappearing slowly into the maze of corridors he had once called home. The crew watched him go, feeling the weight of what they had done or failed to do. The man was free, yet trapped by the memories and walls he had learned to master. Silence returned. The ship inhaled and exhaled, deep and steady, as though acknowledging a hard truth. The worst monsters are not born. They are made, and the consequences are carried on every wave, every plank, every breath. The Aurelian cross floated on, the sea listening, remembering, judging alongside them. The Aurelian cross had grown still. After weeks of terror, the groaning hull, the whispering vents, and the relentless scraping of hidden footsteps, the ship finally seemed to breathe evenly. The storm had passed, the vents were clear, and the pale flower that had haunted every corridor had been swept away by wind and water. The crew moved cautiously, their eyes still alert to every shadow, their hands still brushing against knives and hooks. Yet even they could feel the difference. The corridors no longer whispered. The iron no longer groaned with malicious intent. Every creak was natural, every sigh of wood ordinary. Captain Moorcroft walked the deck slowly, shoulders slumped, face pale. The authority he had wielded so strictly before now felt meaningless. He had commanded the ship and failed. He had controlled men and lost, and yet he survived. The sailors, too, found a fragile peace. They cleaned, tended the decks, and checked the vents, not in fear but out of habit. Lanterns were lit and extinguished at will, meals shared without glance over the shoulder, breaths no longer counted in panic. The rhythm of ordinary life began to return. Thomas Hale was gone. The vents were empty, silent. No flower dust floated in the air, no scraping echoed through hidden corridors. The ghost they had feared, the predator that had haunted them, had become a memory, a shadow that would never truly leave. Yet even in quiet, the ship remembered. The iron, the wood, the very air seemed to carry the echoes of months spent in terror. Each plank had felt the weight of survival. Every vent had learned the rhythm of footsteps and breaths. The Aurelian Cross had become a living map of fear and endurance. Men slept finally, not in terror, but in cautious relief. They lay on bunks in the deck, dreaming of home, of calm seas, of nights without footsteps from within the walls. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories, repairing trust, relearning laughter. Moorcroft, standing at the helm, stared at the horizon. He understood something that could not be spoken. The worst ghosts were not always what you could see. They were what you left behind, what you ignored, and what you carried within yourself. For now the ship was calm, but every sailor knew that silence on a vessel like the Aurelian Cross was fragile. It could shatter with a single wrong step, a single breath, a single memory, and somewhere far below deck, the echoes of the vents lingered, a quiet reminder that survival had a price, and that the ship had learned to remember everything. The Aurelian Cross breathed evenly once more. For now, years passed. But the Aurelian Cross never truly left the memories of those who sailed her. Sailors spoke of her in hushed tones, warning others to avoid narrow ships, old iron and hidden vents. Some called her haunted. Others said she remembered. Stories spread about a man abandoned and transformed by darkness, who had turned vents into a labyrinth, teaching fear its own lesson. About flower dust that could make shadows alive, footsteps that followed even in silence, and a ship that breathed with life or vengeance. The survivors carried the lesson with them. They slept differently, walked carefully, and listened constantly to every creak, every sigh, every whisper. The sea had become a teacher. It reminded them that mistakes never vanish. They wait, they grow. They become something more than fear, a living presence, patient and observant. Captain Moorcroft aged quickly after that voyage. Discipline, once his power, now felt hollow. Authority without understanding was nothing. He would stand on distant docks watching the water, seeing echoes of Thomas Hale in every shadow. He would feel the ship in his bones, hear the vents breathe even years later. And Thomas became legend, not as a monster but as a survivor. A man who had endured the impossible, shaped the ship into his labyrinth, and forced fear itself to respect him. Men whispered his name not in stories of revenge, but as a caution. Never leave a life behind. Never ignore suffering. Never underestimate what desperation can create. The Aurelian Cross itself remained in port, long abandoned. Yet wood remembers, iron remembers, vents remember. Ships like men carry memory. Some nights, sailors passing by would swear they heard a soft scrape, a muffled laugh, or the faint hiss of flower dust drifting through the air. The ocean, too, remembered. Waves carried tales of the labyrinth below deck, teaching anyone who would listen that the most dangerous ghosts are not always supernatural. They are human, and sometimes they wait quietly for the right moment, hidden in plain sight within the vessels that traverse the deep. And so, the story of the Aurelian Cross became part of maritime legend, a tale whispered from harbor to harbor, a warning to those who dared sail without caution, without respect, without understanding that some vessels hold more than cargo. They hold the echoes of the living, the lost and the forgotten. The worst ghosts are the ones we make, and the ones we refuse to see. The Aurelian Cross breathed one final time. The sea listened. And somewhere deep in the memory of the ship and the minds of those who survived, the labyrinth lived on,